We're also going to stand up for our dairy farmers in Wisconsin. And I've been reading about it, and I've been talking about it for a long time, and that demands really immediately fair trade with all of our trading partners, and that includes Canada.
Hello and welcome to Beneath the Surface. I'm your host, Hayden Hanna. On this episode, we're talking about the potential trade war between Canada and the U.S. What you just heard was Donald Trump making a comment about the plight of the Wisconsin farmers and essentially blaming Canada for an unfair trade agreement. So I'm joined by Bruce Sargent, who is co-founder of Farm Boy Productions, or founder, or...
Founder and operator, yeah.
Founder and operator. And so what do you do? What's your relationship with, I guess, the agriculture scene in Guelph through that role?
Yeah, so a bit of background. I grew up on a dairy farm just outside of Toronto. We milk 60 cows on about 300 acres. And we've been farming for 4 generations of dairy and longer than that, just farming in general. So I went to town for high school and got really involved in communications technology and building websites and video production. And so I started Farm Boy Productions as a grade 12 project. And when I went to university in Guelph, I studied marketing management and kept the business going. And by the time I was ready to graduate, I was busy enough to make a run at the business full time. And so I create video and photography for farms and agricultural businesses, and the groups that we deal with prefer to deal with us because myself and my employee have a farming background, so we know where to go, what to film, where not to go, what not to ask, and farmers are just generally more comfortable working with us. We still make good stuff, but we don't have the big bloat of an agency to do the same kind of content. So through my work, I've gotten a lot more experience in communicating and just involvement in social media and creating videos. And so for the last about 2 years, I have been quite active, specifically due to supply management being in the news. And my family calls me the elected spokesperson because everyone else doesn't like to do this sort of thing. So I don't mind doing it. I'm okay at it. And I'm happy to do it for them because they aren't comfortable doing it and they're busy farming. So that's why I speak up for agriculture.
Okay, wonderful. So so it sounds like you have a pretty good sense of the agriculture scene in Ontario and in southeastern Ontario anyway, and probably more broadly across Canada. I guess for me, as someone that, I've was born in a small kind of agricultural town, surrounded by dairy farmers, but I was never of them really. I was never a farmer. So when I see this stuff, but I have a lot of respect for them, obviously. So when I see this stuff in the news about, I guess, Donald Trump and kind of the trade wars that are, or the potential trade war going on.
Yeah.
I guess I have a little trouble understanding it because I'm not steeped in the kind of dairy farm culture. So I just wanted to I guess speak with someone that's more experienced than I am and that has more knowledge. So I guess if you could just give a little background on what supply management is and how it differs from I guess the system they have in the United States in particular. And what they're doing, if you know anything about that, and then maybe even just broadly globally, like is it a unique system globally, or is it just, or are other countries doing it as well?
Yeah, so let's go all the way back. So 50 years ago, just over 50 years ago, supply management was started by a politician who was actually a beef farmer from Western Canada. So he looked at specifically eggs and dairy and the poultry industry and saw and this is a quote, it was uncontrollable chaos in the markets. So there were huge fluctuations in prices, which led to huge fluctuations in the actual number of farmers. And these commodities, specifically eggs, milk, turkey, and chicken, were very often being sold in the grocery store for less than it cost to make them. And so when these politicians 50 years ago looked around the world, and specifically the USA, they saw huge amounts of their annual budgets going into farm subsidies to supplement the farm income and to try to stabilize the food supply. And they thought that's not a long-term solution, so supply management started to be the discussion. And so at that time, every farm that was currently in operation had their farm assessed, and they were issued a certain amount of quota. And the majority of farms were actually scaled back because there was just too much production for what the population needed, because the goal of supply management was to feed the domestic population. And so over those 50 years, supply management has done really well in Canada. Some people will say that the number of farm families has contracted under supply management, but they have contracted at the same rate as beef farmers and cash croppers. There's just more consolidation, more technology, and less people willing to do the amount of work that's involved. So 50 years later, the world is still very volatile, especially for milk and eggs. People want to pay below the cost of production for these products, and grocery stores like to use them as loss leaders. And so in the US and in Australia and in Europe, which are our three biggest competition, they still have huge subsidy budgets to supplement the income of farmers because they're not being paid fairly from the marketplace. And so the next bit is that when you compare, some people often say that, why are these markets being protected when other ones are not? Egg and milk is protected, beef farmers aren't. Beef farmers have done well for 50 years, so, why can't dairy farmers do the same thing? Beef and milk are completely different products. Even milk and grain are completely different products. A grain farmer does trade on the open market, but they have a lot more control over the contracts that they get and the price of their product. And at the same time, the milk at our farm is picked up every 2 days. So if the price changes in those 2 days, which it does in the US, it'll change their milk check. Whereas in Canada, we don't have that same sort of volatility because of supply management. So that's huge. We can't just tell our cows to stop giving milk tomorrow because we don't need it anymore. You can gradually wean a cow off of making milk, but what they're saying right now is that in the US, they basically need to kill almost 10% of their herd because they're just overproducing by so much. So that kind of gives you the backstory of supply management. So then, how it works is that every year, the Canadian Dairy Commission does a cost of production study. And so they look at a sample size of the Canadian dairy farmers and collect everything from feed cost to energy cost to labor, and they come up with a cost of production. And so we take that number to the processors on an annual basis and say, okay, as a country, as the Canadian dairy farmers, this is the price that we need to cover our cost of production and to make a living in this year. When prices go down, we ask for less. But point is that we have the ability to ask for that cost of production number. Whereas in the US, milk is traded on the Chicago stock market, and because there's so much of it, the price is low. Basic economics, supply demand. When there's too much supply, the price is low, and so they're being paid off of the stock market essentially. And if Trump tweets something silly, or if somebody hits the wrong button in Chicago, they'll lose ground on their price. And so for about 4 years, American dairy farmers have been paid less than cost of production. So they're having to borrow money and take on a loss just to stay in operation. So that's the big thing, is that price, that fair price. Some people the critics will say that it's a guaranteed price, and guaranteed income, and that's not what it is. Margins are still very tight on the dairy farm, and you have to be competitive, and you have to be a good business operator to stay afloat, because if you get below that cost of production, then you're losing money too. So then the other big thing is that we have economists that work for the dairy farmers in every province that tell us how much demand is needed, how much demand there is, so that we can meet it with supply. So there's only enough quota issued for the amount of supply that exists. So we're very often as close to that line as possible. Anytime that we go over it, there can be the potential for waste, but it's very rare that we do. We push it as much as possible. So because everyone has a fixed amount, we've had to purchase the quota to make, 60 cows worth of milk. That means that when the price does go down, which it actually did last month, we're not suddenly going to start making more milk to make up that money that we've lost. In the U.S., when the price goes down, they milk more cows to earn the same amount of money with more quantity, which, I know sounds really silly, but when your costs stay the same, your income needs to stay the same. So if the only way to do that is to make more milk, that's what you do.
No, that totally makes sense. I mean, from the point of view of the Americans. I mean, if you have a certain cost, you need to make the money. So if it sells for cheaper, you need to make more. So that totally makes sense how these kind of individual challenges wreak havoc on the market on a broad scale.
And so on a daily basis, the state of Wisconsin. On a weekly basis, the state of Wisconsin actually wastes the same amount of milk that the province of Ontario makes.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So yeah, absolutely.
So how does the milk does Canada export any milk? Like how does that work within the system of supply management? Like, is the amount of milk that needs to be exported considered in the demand, or so how does that work?
The system doesn't measure for export at all. So the only time we would export is when there is excess production, which is very few times, and when it does happen, it's such a small quantity when you consider how much is on the global market. Like I said, Wisconsin wastes the same amount of milk that Ontario makes in a week, but when you take that to the whole nation of the USA and apply it over a year, they waste, trying to remember the number, 45 million gallons per year. So they're trying to export that, and there's just not a market for it, essentially.
Right. That's so from the so the criticism that I sort of understand is that one of the things that makes supply management work is by keeping imported milk out of the country, which is done through really high tariffs on imported milk. So I guess from the point of view of other countries, that certainly makes sense for Canadians and Canadian dairy farmers as a measure to protect their livelihood. I guess from the point of view of other countries, do you see why they would be upset with that particular measure, or does it make sense to you? Like, if you were in their shoes, would you be upset with the Canadian supply management system, or?
Dairy trade is a very hypocritical trade, I guess you could say. So the U.S. will cry and bang and scream that we're unfair towards them for trading milk, but they actually have a 7-to-1 benefit in trade ratio. So they bring in 700 million liters, $700 million annually of imports to Canada, and they only allow about 100 million per year into the U.S. So they don't want fair trade or free trade. They want free trade out. And the thing is, so the next kind of complainer on that list is New Zealand. They want to send milk to Canada, which is basically the furthest possible geographical distance away for a fresh product to travel.
Right.
But they have a completely different climate than us. So they have, I couldn't even tell you how many more cows they milk, but they don't have to build barns. Like, they milk their cows with tractor trailers in pastures. And so they don't have the same operating costs that we have here. They don't have winter. And so when they're putting cheese or whatever on a boat and sending it all the way over here, like, that's not free trade either. And an important statistic in there is that about 92% of the milk produced in the world is consumed in the country of origin. So only about 8 to 6% is actually traded. And so, yes, Canada does have these tariff walls, but we already do allow 10% access without tariffs. And it's only when we go above that level that the tariffs kick in, and it's to prevent dumping. So that 270% that Trump has been whining about only kicks in when they go over the amount that we've agreed to import from them. And so it doesn't come into play, but he's, getting hung up on it. And at the same time, the only time 270% would kick in is if we fill how much we're supposed to bring in. And the U.S. has the same sort of system. They would have a higher tariff wall if we sent more to them, but they only actually accept less than 1% of what they're supposed to. So we're filling our 10%, and they're not even touching 1% of what they're supposed to be accepting in trade. Right.
Well, it does seem like Trump has this one sense of the tariff walls, but I've watched a few interviews with dairy farmers from Wisconsin, and they seem to know what's really going on, which is overproduction, and they don't seem to be blaming Canada really. But it is Trump that's kind of saying, "Oh, we're gonna get a fair deal for the Wisconsin farmers," but it doesn't seem to be Canada's an issue with Canada. It seems to be an overproduction issue or something like that. But in the short term, I mean, if Trump's trying to force open a market for the milk in Wisconsin, I mean, is that a viable short-term goal, even if it doesn't make sense in the long term, even just to force open a market for all that waste? Or I'm not sure what his end goal is here.
Yeah,
and maybe you don't either.
His angle is that the processors have his ear. It's the processor lobby in the U.S. that has Trump's ear, and if you ask any politician in Canada, they'll tell you that, the people that they deal with in terms of Trump will tell them that Trump only remembers the most recent thing he was told. So when the dairy processors say, 270%, we want access, it's not fair, that's what he's been saying, right? Wisconsin farmers don't want to see supply management eliminated. There's actually farmer co-ops in Wisconsin that are having dairy farmers from Ontario visit them to explain to them how supply management works, because they're considering implementing it, which would further upset the processors that have Donald Trump's ear.
Right, because so the supply management, I mean, is that implemented by, I mean, in Canada it was, you said a West Coast or a West politician.
It was the federal and provincial government, yeah.
Okay, but it does it necessarily have to be implemented by them? I mean, can a group of farmers just get together and say we're gonna advocate for this price, or
yeah, so
my understanding is kind of like that it's a union, so that it doesn't necessarily have to stem right from the government. It can be just farmers getting together and joining up. I mean,
there are co-ops in the U.S. that are implementing inventory management or different twists on the same premise. They're trying to stay away from the supply management word because it gets people excited that the government's going to control everything that they do. The problem with that is that unless it is a widespread, like heavily adopted program, those 5 or 6 people that don't join could still overproduce enough to completely screw up the supply and demand of it.
Right. So
that's the crazy thing. People will say, well, you know, the U.S. just needs to start making less milk. Like, you're correct, but unless everyone uniformly says, okay, we're gonna go down by 10%. Oh, we're still overproducing. Okay, we're gonna go down 5%. Unless they do that as a group, all it takes is one big corporate farm with 20,000 head in the U.S. somewhere to say, no, we're staying the same, and everyone else is going to make that less money. They're going to make the same amount of money, and they're going to continue to flood the market.
Right. So from the point of view of a politician trying just to provide milk for his country, just to fill the demand, like I'm really, I guess, attached to the image of the family farm, right? The small hobby farm that's milking cows, and you know, the idea of a farm having like 1,000 cows is sort of wrong to me, right? Like to me, a farm's supposed to be small. It's supposed to be family run, that sort of thing. But for a politician, I mean, you know, what's the advantages of having, you know, small farms scattered throughout the country or province over big super farms? I mean, is there an argument to be made that, you know, having all these smaller farms around producing milk uniformly is actually better than having kind of one super farm that is like super efficient, you know, that sort of thing?
Efficient. An important number here is that the average herd size in Canada is about 70 head of milking cows. The average in the U.S. is 300. And there's actually 130 mega farms in the U.S. that could replace all 11,000 dairy farms in Canada with the milk production. So that just paints a picture of the scale. So the problem is that when you have concentrated farms, you have less services providing, you know, fuel, feed, inputs, what have you, to that singular farm. Whereas if you have many farms distributed over a province or a country, you have multiple service providers. You know, you have more revenue staying in that area in terms of salary and wages for those families and those employees. And all of those people are paying taxes within that region too. So if you think about Listowel, Ontario, I've had a pork farmer tell me that there wouldn't be a hospital in Listowel if not for the fact that there's supply management. Because there's farms in that area that are contributing to the tax base. And so this little town of Listowel has a hospital. And that's because the rural economy in Canada is quite strong. Whereas in the U.S., you see like huge farms that have few employees and they still can have a hard time paying their bills. And so there isn't the investment in the local infrastructure that there is here.
Okay. What about like shipping and stuff too? Like I imagine it must be easier to distribute the milk when you have all these little farms all over, because you don't have to travel across country, across province. You know,
so that's a great point, because if you think about it, for the population that's in, say, PEI, it would be super easy just to take a truck from the mainland. And like maybe they need 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 per day, but they could just get their milk from the mainland and they wouldn't have to have dairy production on the island. But because of supply management, the whole point is to keep the processing and the farming as close to the population as possible. Population that it's serving, those little communities do have dairy farms, and even like Alberta and Saskatchewan, like those provinces really don't necessarily need to have dairy farms. They could have their milk shipped in from BC or Ontario, but with supply management and with each province being responsible to fill their needs, and if they need more, it can come from other provinces, then that means that there's always going to be those farms in those areas.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that stuck out to me, is because, like, milk must be incredibly difficult to ship. I mean, although I did have one guy that I was talking to. He runs Dairy Check, which is I think some robotic thing to monitor the milk that they brought in. So anyway, he installs these machines. But anyway, he was saying, yeah, like the transportation and shipping is fairly difficult. Although I'm sure the technology is evolving somewhat. He was talking about like evaporated milk, I think, or something where you suck out the water and then put it back in afterwards once it gets to the location. But that seems like a lot of work when you can just have the farm nearby and have the milk shipped fresh and avoid all that.
People don't realize that when there's an accident and a milk truck's involved and they spill milk, the same hazmat team that cleans up the oil spill actually cleans up the milk. Just because milk does have active bacteria in it, and if it stays on the road or gets into the environment, it does have an impact on it. So yeah, it has to be shipped every 2 days from the dairy farm, and if we have some sort of weather delay, that it stays in the tank for 78 hours, the milk actually gets dumped, just because like the processors need the freshest milk to do what they need to.
Hey guys, sorry for interrupting the podcast. I'd just like to remind you that Beneath the Surface is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find the Twitter handle and Instagram handle is at Bend the Surface. Beneath the Surface was taken, so it's at Bend the Surface. And also, if you are enjoying this content, I would encourage you to support us on Patreon, become a patron. The description to that will be found in the description of this episode. We would really like and appreciate the support. And now back to my conversation with Bruce Sargent. So I know, you're not a politician, and you're not, you don't advertise yourself as a politician at all, or a political pundit, I guess. But how do you feel the Canadian government has been handling this kind of this kind of game that Trump's playing? I mean, have they reacted well, appropriately, inappropriately? Just what are your thoughts on that? And maybe some of the other people as well, like that you've talked to. I mean, how are the dairy farmers that you know, how do they feel about Trudeau and what he's been doing, and in Ontario, Doug Ford, and how he's reacted? I mean, what have you seen?
Yeah, people get really nervous about Donald Trump. Farmers get really nervous about Donald Trump just because he's so bombastic and unpredictable, and he doesn't care about the facts. He cares about whatever the last person told him. And so there's a lot of worry and some neuroticism, but Trudeau, like, to his credit, handled it as best as he possibly could. We all know that Trump was just being hard on Trudeau because he wanted to go into North Korea appearing to be strong, which is unfortunate because it's just theater and doesn't have a lot of substance. So Trudeau did his best. We do appreciate his support. He has stood up for us, and his father was prime minister very shortly after supply management came into effect. So the Trudeaus have supported the farmers, and even Trudeau supported supply management in the leadership race that he ran against Martha Hall Finley, who's now one of supply management's greatest critics, even though she won't engage in meaningful conversation with producers to hear about why it's important to farm families and the rural economy. So yeah, we're hoping that NAFTA will be solved sooner than later. We want to see NAFTA happen. We want to make sure that our industry isn't traded away in NAFTA, but we do recognize that we need to give some ground so that our beef farmers and our grain farmers and other businesses in Canada do get access to these markets, which is why in CETA and TPP we did bite the bullet and give up some percentage so that some cheese could be imported, so that beef could go to Europe. But the funny thing is that we're filling the requirements we're supposed to for CETA imports, and the CETA countries threw up non-tariff barriers to Canadian beef to prevent it from being exported to Europe. So that needs to get sorted out, because if we're filling our side, they need to fill theirs, or there's no point in the agreement, really.
Right. It is strange because I come from a very, I mean, I think most kind of small town rural areas are kind of conservative leaning, and I've never heard a good word spoken about Justin Trudeau by these dairy farmers before this particular incident. Like, so it's like I'm kind of living in this really like surreal moment where all of a sudden like Justin Trudeau seems to be making sense to farmers and whatever. It is really weird. Like, so I just I just wanted to ask that because yeah, he seems to be doing okay on this particular issue anyway. So what if you were, I guess, a dairy farmer in the United States, in Wisconsin, say, what is the appropriate solution to their problem, do you think? Or and maybe if you knew that, you would solve all the world's problems. Maybe it's not an easy solution, but I'm just curious, like what's a logical step forward for those dairy farmers in Wisconsin? Like what do you think you'd be doing in that situation?
I think they need to unify in some way, shape, or form, and just collectively agree to make less milk. Like, that's the only solution to their problem right now. There are a couple of them that think that open access to Canada will solve it, but that would just be maybe a year fix, and then they'd be back in the same issue that they are now. So they need to get their overproduction under control so that their price is more reasonable. And maybe that's a good thing to bring up now, is that as much as the farmer is paid less in the US doesn't compare to how the difference in the milk price at the store. So they're getting paid like less than a quarter of what we are for the farm gate price of milk. But when you look at the actual store value of milk, there's maybe like a 20 cent per liter difference in some areas. And so when you think about that, like there's a huge gap there that is obviously going to the processor and the retailer instead of to the farmer. So they need to get more of that price back so that they can make a living and not have to continually rely on the subsidies that the Farm Bill provides to them. So part of it is there's like irrigation subsidies and feed crop subsidies, and there's a wide variety of programs that farmers can have access to, and maybe not all of them do, but that artificially decreases the price of milk, and it makes consumers in the U.S. pay at the grocery store line and then in their taxes as well, which it's not sustainable. Some Canadians will say, well, we'll just take their cheap subsidized milk and it'll make my food cheaper. Like, that's not sustainable. Right. Cheap food is not sustainable. It's going to hurt the farmer. It's eventually going to start to hurt their cows, and it's going to hurt the environment, because if a farmer is comfortable with what they're being paid for, then they're going to take good care of their cows, and they're not going to cut corners on the environment. And that's what happens. Like, when you think about if your paycheck gets cut, you start making cuts in your life, right? So what's the easy thing for you to cut? Probably your dental care, right? And then what's next? Like, are you not exercising where you were? Are you not socializing when you were? Like, there's serious impacts, mental health impacts to these low prices, and I don't think people get just how unfair it can be. I had a conversation with a guy online today where I asked him if his salary was based off of the stock market. He said, well, no, that's ridiculous. And I said, then why should farmers live that way? To which he didn't have much of an answer, but...
Right. It does seem... Well, like, and I find a more general problem is people seem to be pretty far removed from what it's like to be a farmer and like how important they are. And I used to think when I was younger, and this is maybe a broader issue, but when I was younger, like I did grow up in that small kind of farming community. It's called Athens, Ontario. It used to be called Farmersville, actually. So it was a really small kind of farmers town, and um, yeah, it's amazing. Like if you go to anywhere that doesn't really have their food produced in the same area, like a city. I went to school in Kingston, and just they seem to have no grasp on what it's like to be a farmer and how important they are, and how important it is that they are able to make a living uh, and run the family farm the way it was, like it was passed on from their grandfathers, and to continue that tradition into the future with their kids. And when that's cast into doubt like it is now, uh, I can see where a lot of the anxiety is, brewing among the farmers, including those in Wisconsin, right? Because the future is not too sure for them either. So yeah, I really wanted to get this issue kind of sorted out in my head, because, it seemed like a real true problem that, we're facing as a country, and I guess as a continent, the North Americans. So I guess when it comes to supply management, so I just want to get that out of the way. When it comes to supply management, is that sustainable for like a lot of countries to have, that they focus on their domestic demand first, and then import surplus if they have it? Like, to me, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do, and it seems sustainable to do, if the U.S. Did that, if the Europeans did that, wherever else, have New Zealand, wherever. It just seems like a logical thing to do, no matter where you are on the globe. Like, is that the case, or is there sort of like, would that produce some unintended kind of interactions between those markets that could bring it down?
So Australia and the European Union and like a couple countries like Norway, like they used to have supply management, and they got rid of it because there was political pressure from one side or another, and those industries are in turmoil now. The funny thing is that people point to New Zealand and say how great they're doing. New Zealand basically still has supply management. There's one processor, Fonterra, that demands any farm operating on the island buy production shares, aka quota, from them for the right to produce milk. So in the countries that got rid of supply management, they're now using subsidies to artificially reinforce the farm gate price of milk. And in New Zealand, they still have supply management, but it's not, government regulated, so it's not attacked by the libertarians and politicians. So I think it'd be difficult for some of those countries to go back to it, but I don't necessarily think that'd be a reason why they shouldn't. Like I said, 92% of the milk produced in the world is consumed in the country of origin, and it's only that 8% trade. So I think New Zealand would have the most to lose in terms of, turning their eyes into more domestic production, because they are such a powerhouse in dairy. But like the U.S. They could double their farm gate price if they produced less milk and focused on more of a local market, and then then the governments wouldn't need those subsidies, and they could use them elsewhere in their budgeting for the year to provide other services. So yeah, I think, I mean, as much as I think supply management would be a good idea for them, it's up to them. And I think, especially in the U.S.'s case, I think there's just too much capitalism in between. They're believers in capitalism, and they just won't adopt this somewhat restrictive measure, I guess, unfortunately.
So what about across borders? I mean, is there a way to incorporate, incorporate the U.S. demand for milk into a joint supply management system between the U.S. and Canada? Like, is that, I know that's like a really far fetched like type of thing, but I'm thinking like just economically, like is that something that would be possible or that would make sense in some sort of like trade agreement where, the U.S. and Canada, it's supply management, but it's supply and demand of both the U.S. and Canada incorporated into that system.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, but they again would have to get their overproduction under control, right? So it's possible. I wouldn't say it's necessarily realistic. Yeah, and if you think about it geographically, I don't understand why people do get so upset with Canada just wanting to make enough milk for itself. And people will say, well, we could be exporting and we could be more profitable. It's just not possible. It's not possible with the amount of overproduction that's out there and the price of milk. It's just not possible.
Right. Okay. So that is one other thing I was wondering, because it seems like, yeah, if you focus on your domestic demand, that there's a potential to exploit another market that's being missed. But you're right. If there's overproduction elsewhere, then the chances that that market actually exists is not there, right? I mean,
well, and kind of interesting sidebar on that point is that so China has been plagued with low consumer confidence for decades in their dairy industry, and they don't have the same amount of production that Canada does. And so they're actually building a plant in Kingston where they're going to be creating baby food, like skimming the milk and creating baby formula and sending it back to China. So they're investing very heavily in Ontario and accepting supply management because it's going to mean that they have a safe and reliable food source, production supply, that they're investing in Canada. And just 2 weeks ago, Coca-Cola through Fairlife is investing in a plant in Peterborough, Ontario, because they want to invest in a market that's more stable. So we see investments in Canada because people like our system and like the safety of our milk and the reliability of it, whereas in some American states they're regressing. Like the processors are closing, there's more consolidation, and there's not the same amount of growth. So it's interesting. The next 5 years are going to be very interesting to see whether the U.S. votes for another Republican president, and whether NAFTA is done by then, and yeah, interesting times.
Well, I'm glad I'm not a dairy farmer at the moment, but also glad that they exist and are willing to put up with the turmoil, because I'll probably go drink a glass of milk after this. I don't know, but
Yeah.
So I read also I think, or I didn't read, it was an interview, Chapman's as well. They get all their milk, a lot of their milk from Canada too, and they were kind of saying like, yeah, they like the guarantee that the product's going to be, a good product and high quality and reliable and all that. So I don't know. I have a hard time making sense of it as an outsider, to the dairy industry, just what exactly, from Trump's point of view, what the problem is. And I think a lot of dairy farmers in Wisconsin seem to be thinking the same thing, as far as I can tell. But
theater.
It's just I mean,
back on The Apprentice, and he's just looking for headlines.
Yeah, and that very well could be it. I mean, and I was listening too, like the other tariffs on steel and aluminum. I was listening to Kevin O'Leary of all people, and he's big into the auto industry, and his the chassis of a car, which is made out of steel or aluminum or whatever, crosses the border from Detroit to wherever in Canada, 7 times before it's made, and if it's being taxed like every time, like people are gonna leave. So it just, I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I think these are all just words from Trump, but people have said that before, and he's gone ahead anyway. But well, time will tell, I guess.
They say that he's the steel in particular is preaching to the Rust Belt states, which he needs to win in the midterm elections this fall. Because if he loses significant support, I can't remember which chamber, whether it's the Senate or the House, one of them could turn Democrat, and then it's much more likely that he could be impeached before the end of his term. So, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to tax steel, because it's going to hurt everybody on both sides of the border, and especially the trade war with China. China canceled like $300 million worth of soybean contracts with American farmers because of Trump's actions. So that's a huge hit to the rural economy for people that voted for Trump. And when China goes elsewhere to source those soybeans, whether it's Canada or Brazil, China's not going to go back to the U.S. after this. Like, it's going to take time. It's not going to be an immediate shift that this shift away is going to hit, right? So that's huge. Like, that's really huge. That could seriously hurt his chances in the midterms if it comes down as big as they say it is.
Well, it's so, like I said, I mean, I was just struck by, and especially with Doug Ford too. I think the quote was, I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with Trudeau or whatever. And any time when you see such a, I would say, opposite or polar, two people that is as conservative as you can get and as liberal as you can get, and they decide that collectively that this is insane. I think it's insane. I just can't quite. And part of the reason I wanted to do this episode was just because I wanted to figure it out. I don't really understand what's going on or whatever. I'm not an economist either, but I'm glad I was able to talk to you and kind of understand more, what's going on. And I'm glad you agree that it seems not to make sense, and to kind of validate my, my suspicion about it. But
maybe just as we're kind of winding down, there's one more point I wanted to hit.
Sure.
A lot of times we hear from our critics that depending on the size of the family, supply management costs Canadians $200 to $600 more per year in their grocery bill.
Right, and I have heard that. Yeah,
I've looked at those studies. One of them is called Milked and Feathered. I've read it pretty thoroughly, and it's deeply flawed because it's biased, and it wanted to come up with a number, and so it compared Windsor and Vancouver as the only Canadian data points, and it didn't actually reference which cities in the U.S. it used to compare. It said that it was the Midwest region of the U.S.,
right.
Which, when I did digging, I found that was the least expensive dairy market in the U.S. So least expensive dairy market, with like Vancouver, one of the highest cost of living markets in Canada, and it was only a single year worth of pricing data, and it was 2010, which is when the American and Canadian dollar were almost at parity, which isn't normal, because right now, when it's at 30 cents difference, and you factor that into the equation, milk in Canada and the U.S. are that much closer to one another. And it also said that it didn't even bother looking into the subsidies in the U.S. because it didn't expect them to go away if Canada did eliminate supply management.
And I assume,
so when you think about
that's a brutal.
That's
just brutal.
When you think about that, and there are statistics in the study on elasticity of food, like price elasticity, and it showed that red meat was actually more impacted by price elasticity because of its higher cost than dairy. But the article was about supply management and completely ignores that side of things. So Yeah, it's really sad when people fall back on arguments like that, because it completely ignores that our labor is more expensive in Canada and our hydro is more expensive, and like, labor doesn't just impact us, it impacts the processors too. So like, they can't pay what the Americans do for the entire supply chain, right?
Right.
It's not just the farmers that are paying more for labor, it's the truck driver, it's the processor, it's the grocery store. So guess what? It might cost more in Canada, but
Well, and I assume some of the cost
wage,
as
so.
well. I imagine some of the cost as well would be made up in the taxes that you have to pay for the subsidies, right? Or like I don't know how much that would actually be, but like it's not like you can just take the price of milk. You also have to take the price of the subsidy that's going to the farmer that produces
Yep.
the milk, right? So
Yep. Well, and that's hidden cost, right?
yeah, yeah. That sounds like brutal research. I'll have to look it up and have a good laugh maybe later tonight. But yeah, like I said, even if you assume that it does cost more, I mean, there's all these other factors that go into it, as you said. So yeah, it's certainly not a simple. Anytime that someone comes to a complex issue like this and says like, "Oh, it's just that one thing," that's the problem.
It's just price.
I mean,
argument over.
yeah, that makes me suspicious right away. So anyway, thank you for talking to me. I mean, that was great. I feel more enlightened. I feel validated as well. So that's good. Are there any other points you'd like to make before we wind down here? Or
I'll just end on the one point that I always try to hit. Like, farmers, dairy farmers, egg farmers, chicken farmers, poultry farmers, they're not getting a guaranteed profit from supply management. They're being given the fair chance to get their cost of production, and if they can operate efficiently and effectively and work very hard, they can make a living. Like, that's what they're asking for. Like, there's times that dairy farmers would be paid less than minimum wage. Like, they're not protected the same way that, minimum wage employees are. Like, they don't get a guaranteed income. And it's no different than a politician having a salary that usually grows. It doesn't go down when the market value does. So, if we want people to do these very labor intensive, long hours, long days, physical labor, like mentally demanding jobs, they need to be paid fairly for them. Otherwise, there's just not going to be people interested in doing it.
don't forget the early mornings.
Oh yeah, there's that. And the late nights.
Yeah, early mornings, late night. I tried. My grandfather had me milk cows for like a week, and I was like, "Nah, I'm good. I'll go to school or something and do that." But he said the same thing.
A friend of mine last night sent me a Snapchat that she was up at 4:30 for chores, and she was going to bed at 11 because there had been a breakdown in the barn that night.
Yeah.
So
remarkable people. Well, like I said, thank you so much for talking to me. Enlightened, validated. I hope everything works out for the dairy farmers. And if there are any dairy farmers or farmers at all that are looking for some marketing help, I'll point you in Bruce's direction here. So
sounds good. Well, I appreciate the time, and I'm glad that you're out there looking for information, because lots of people take the issue very simply and look at one side and then fill their confirmation bias and don't need any more information. So I appreciate that you're looking for more.
Well, the show is called Beneath the Surface, so I am trying to get beneath the surface. So great. All right. Thank you again, Bruce, and talk to you later.
Yeah, sounds good.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. I just wanted to remind you that you should definitely follow me on Twitter, on Instagram at BendTheSurface. I just also wanted to let you know that I have a couple interesting episodes coming up. On Saturday, I'm going to post an episode with my Uncle Glenn. And we're going to be talking about a book that I recommended him called Amusing Ourselves to Death. which talks a lot about the subtitle is Public Discourse in the Entertainment or Show Business Age. So we're going to talk about that book a little bit, and what we think the internet has to do with public discourse, because the book was written in 82 or in the 80s, and so it was kind of pre-internet, and so we wanted to extend the conversation in the book to things like podcasts and the internet in general. I'm also working on another episode with a childhood babysitter of mine, Matt Vanderveld, who's the founder of Third Eye Photography, and he's written a book entitled Abandoned Asylums, with a lot of great photography in there. So we're going to talk a little bit about that book, and also mental illness and the development of how mental illness is treated. So definitely keep an eye out for that episode. We're going to be talking on Thursday, and so the episode's probably going to be out next week sometime. So keep your eye out for that. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.